Today for ADG Pro, we're going back to an old favorite of mine, Reaping the Dungeon, also known as Dungeon Rogue, which is one of the most unique dungeon crawls ever made, to answer a curious question that I've always had about it. See, this game is so unique that it doesn't even have experience points. Instead, you collect a substance known as raw crystals throughout your adventure, which you can then spend on tiny improvements to your stats. The idea being that by making more and more improvements to the same stat, it becomes considerably more powerful over time. So the question we're going to answer today is, can you reach the end of the game with maximum stats? In fact, I'm going to give you the short answer right now. Yeah, this is why this video is a week late, because there's quite a bit of nuance to this. So much so that I thought the answer was technically yes, if you were determined enough to exploit a very specific thing. But then found out at the very last minute while editing the original video together that this very specific thing actually has an unexpected limit due to the way the game's been coded. Thus, if that limit didn't exist and you had a massive amount of time to kill, then it would be possible. But it's actually not. So, let's go over all the steps I took to come to this conclusion. Firstly, we have to figure out how much raw crystal we even need to reach maximum stat points. The improvement panel has a list of the various stats we can improve, and I do want to point out right away that improving weapon and device proficiency doesn't count, because even though you can spend raw crystals to improve those, you can also spend credits on them instead while at a weapon or device store. So it's better that we put our raw crystals towards all the other things that we can't spend credits on. Going down the list from top to bottom, we first have the defensive stats for the 5 types of enemy attacks: specials, tail attacks, kicks, bites, and claw attacks, which are the percent chances of each of those attack types missing. Next we have damage improvement, which is a raw percentage bonus to the damage you deal, followed by cell plant extraction talent, which is a percentage bonus to any cells you get from any cell plants, oxygen expense, which is how much oxygen you consume per move you make, performing speed, which is handled in kind of a weird way, but basically determines how many moves you get compared to the enemy creatures, depending on whose performing speed is higher. And finally, visual and mapping, which affects how many tiles out you can see in each of the 4 cardinal directions. Now, we can see how much each of these cost initially easily enough, but the cost to improve each of these stats goes up every time you improve them. So in order to determine how high each can get, we're going to need some raw crystals right away, and lots of them. However, I didn't exactly feel like playing through huge chunks of the game just to solve this initial preliminary piece of information we need to know to even begin testing this properly. So this got me wondering if hacking the save files was something I could try. Well, sure enough, the save files are completely not obfuscated in the slightest. In fact, if you go digging into a save file with a hex editor and look up hex address 11E2 or decimal address 4578, that's the long integer the raw crystals are stored in. And thus, setting the next 3 byte values in sequence to 9F, 86, and 01, we can give our save file exactly 99,999 raw crystals to spend. Technically, you could set it higher. However, this game has a tendency to crash if any of its display values exceed the number of digits allocated. The most notorious late-game example of this being if you have over 90,000 oxygen and pick up an oxygen star, which suddenly gives you over 10,000 more oxygen all at once, since the oxygen indicator tops out at only 5 digits. By cheating in the required raw crystals, I was able to confirm both the raw crystal quantities required, as well as the maximums each of these stats can reach. Let's again go in order. All 5 defensive values start at 100 raw crystals for the first 1%, but their costs increase at different rates. Special goes up by 30 raw crystals for each percentage point, tail goes up by 22, kick goes up by 18, bite goes up by 14, and claw goes up by 10. All 5 defensive stats top out at 99%, meaning even at maximum, there's still a 1 in 100 chance you'll get hit by these attacks. In any case, this makes the total amount of raw crystals spent to max out each of these 155,430 for special, 116,622 for tail, 97,218 for kick, 77,814 for bite, and 58,410 for claw. Or if you want to max out all 5 of the defensive stats and become virtually invulnerable to the creatures, you would need to spend 505,494 raw crystals. Next up are damage improvement and extraction talent, both of which also start at 100 raw crystals for the first percentage point, with damage improvement going up by 10 raw crystals per percentage point, and extract talent going up by 6 raw crystals per percentage point, both of which top out at 99%. Thus, to get virtually double damage going costs a total of 58,410 raw crystals, and virtually double cell extraction from cell plants costs a total of 39,006 raw crystals. Next is oxygen expense, which is kind of a weird one. This one starts at 1.3, meaning you're consuming one oxygen cell and 3/10 of another with each move taken. The initial improvement to this stat costs 250 raw crystals, dropping the rate of consumption by 1/10 down to 1.2. However, the rate of increase in terms of the raw crystal costs are horribly inconsistent. In fact, they're hard-coded, and they kinda seem a bit arbitrary. But essentially, with enough raw crystals, you can bring this stat all the way down to 0.1, meaning you'd consume only a single oxygen cell for every 10 moves made. But the total cost to get your oxygen expense all the way down to that level is 105,955 raw crystals. Next up is performing speed, which starts at 1 and initially costs 1,500 raw crystals to improve, which is a big initial expense, but given how powerful performing speed is in terms of surviving combat, it's kind of important to get this one going before too long. Well, just like with the oxygen expense, the values for this are hard-coded, but this trait can only be upgraded 4 times to a total value of 5 performing speed, with the total cost to perform all 4 upgrades being only 31,250 raw crystal. Lastly, we have the visual and mapping traits. Now, each cardinal direction starts at just 1 point of viewing distance, with the initial increase you perform costing 280 raw crystals. However, an important thing to note here is that even though there's 4 different viewing directions, they all tie in with each other in terms of the improvement costs. Thus, if you improve one direction, it now becomes more expensive to improve any of the 4 directions. Plus, because of the modified 80x25 text mode being used to render the game, the decision was made to allow roughly twice as much viewing distance to the east and west compared to the north and south. Thus, north and south cap out at a viewing distance of 7 tiles, while east and west cap out at 15. In any event, the improvement cost goes up by 70 raw crystals anytime you improve any of the 4 viewing directions, and to max out all 4 directions requires a total of 40 upgrades. Thus, the total cost to max out your viewing distance is 65,800 raw crystals. I've also listed here how many raw crystals it takes to do 4 improvements at a time, 1 in each direction, up to a viewing distance of 7 in all directions, as I find that's the best way to handle the viewing distance increases. But when everything is said and done, if you want maximum stats in all of these categories, the total number of raw crystals you will need over the course of the entire game comes out to 747,505. So, now we just have to figure out how possible or impossible it is to actually get that many. Let's start by going over how raw crystals are obtained. At no point over the course of the game are you able to flat out buy raw crystals. Instead, there are 3 specific sources of raw crystals: defeating creatures, finding them loose on the ground, or as a selectable bonus when you clear out all of the creatures from any dungeon floor. Let's tackle that last one first, since it's the simplest. Every time you clear out all of the creatures on a dungeon floor, you get to choose from one of 4 bonuses, the first of which is always credits, but the next 3 are randomly generated and equate to either a quantity of cells, mushrooms, mapping orbs, maximum load, or raw crystals. After doing some testing, I was able to figure out pretty quickly that these results are functioning very similarly to the raw crystal costs themselves, having a base value which goes up by a fixed quantity multiplied by how deep you are in the dungeon. For instance, with credits, the base value is 500, and the added quantity is the current depth multiplied by 2. Thus, at 10 meters, the credits bonus is 520, at 20 meters it's 540, 30 meters 560, 40 meters 580, etc. For energy cells, the base is 350 and the depth multiplier is 1.2. Oxygen cells has a base of 800 and a depth multiplier of 1.5. Health cells have a base of 250 and a multiplier of 1. And raw crystals has a base of 300 and a multiplier of 1.2. With this information in hand, and given that the final depth you can reach is 650 meters, and yes, it is possible to get the clear bonus on every single dungeon floor, this makes the total amount of raw crystals you can get with this method 45,240. Which is not even a tenth of what we're going to need to max out all of our stats, and the only way you can even achieve this maximum is with save scumming. So clearly this bonus alone isn't going to cut it. Now before we move on to trying to figure out the averages from the other sources of raw crystals, something I need to point out is that this is a long game. If you're playing through this legitimately, it'll probably take around 20 hours to do a full run, if you're exploring every nook and cranny there is. So to help speed this along, to figure out the rest of the things I needed to know, I decided to do some more save file hacking. Specifically, the very next value in the save file after the raw crystals are your credits, stored at hex address 11E6, decimal address 4582. And you can give yourself 999,999 credits by making the next 3 byte values read 3F420F. With tons of raw crystals and tons of credits, you can make yourself virtually unstoppable. And while this certainly made progressing through the entire game faster and easier, I still needed to keep track of a couple things and explore most of every dungeon floor that I descended into. Specifically, with the various creatures present, I not only needed to figure out what dungeon floors each type of creature appeared at, but I also needed to figure out how many creatures were appearing on each dungeon floor and see if I could find a pattern to those numbers. Not to mention figure out if there was any weighting involved, affecting how common or uncommon the various creatures were. And I needed to know the raw crystal quantities awarded by each type of creature. Plus, with the loose raw crystals that you find, I had to find out what sizes of loose raw crystal piles could appear from what dungeon floors onwards, what quantities you would expect to find, and again had to determine if there was any weighting with the randomization. Made even more complicated by special raw crystal boxes, which can eventually start showing up, producing random quantities of raw crystal drops when they're opened. For creatures, the math actually turned out surprisingly simple. The maximum quantity of creatures for each floor is 17 plus 1 per 10 meters descended. Thus, on the first dungeon floor at 10 meters, there can be a maximum of 18, 20 meters the maximum is 19, 30 meters is 20 max, 40 meters is 21 max, etc. 150 meters and 650 meters are special though, seen as 150 meters mark the end of the shareware version, where you would get the Oxide rifle, and it has a special final gauntlet that you have to make it through, while 650 meters marks the end of the full experience and basically has a giant open room filled with creatures that you have to survive. 150 meters always has 43 creatures to face, and 650 meters always has 58 creatures to face. However, for all other dungeon floors except 150 and 650, these are maximums. The actual quantity of enemies fluctuates and appears to be any value between 100% of the maximum and 60% of the maximum. And there's no weightings to any of this, thus you'll average about 80% of the maximum creature potentials over the course of the game. And furthermore, there's no weightings to the creatures themselves. Every single creature has an equal chance of appearing once you're deep enough for a particular kind of creature to appear, with new creatures being introduced typically every 1 or 2 dungeon floors, making for a total of 39 different creatures you'll face over the course of the game, the last of which, the Cyblinoid, not being introduced until all the way down at 580 meters. So, because there's no weightings, we can just take the mean averages of everything, apply all the proper appearance points and enemy quantities, and after plugging this all into a huge spreadsheet, I was able to calculate that the average amount of raw crystals you'll get in total from defeating every enemy you're faced with over the course of a full run through the game is about 144,509. Which is nowhere close to the 747,505 we need to max out our stats. Thus, our last bastion of hope for legitimately maxing out our stats seems to be the loose crystal piles. Now these start appearing from 20 meters onward, and initially appear in sizes of 15 per pile. The pile sizes of 35 start appearing at 50 meters down, pile sizes of 60 start appearing at 110 meters down, and the largest pile size of 225 starts appearing at 210 meters down. Furthermore, I was making sure to track the counts of the various piles, and notice there was no weighting here either. Once a particular size of pile can show up, it has equal chances of showing up compared to all of the other raw crystal piles. Complicating this calculation, though, are the raw crystal boxes. Now, these start appearing at 250 meters, and when you open one up, there appears to be a roughly 2 in 3 chance for each tile in the 3x3 tile space around the box, including over top of the box itself, to spawn a random pile of raw crystals. Thus, on average, you get 6 random raw crystal piles from these boxes. In terms of how many raw crystal piles and boxes you can find, though, that ended up being tricky to measure. But the best I could figure out is that it ties in with the normal randomization of dungeon elements, which, if we assume this starts at 100% at 10 meters, goes up to roughly 250% by 650 meters. So you find about 2.5 times more stuff per dungeon floor by the end of the game compared to around the start. This is a very rough estimate though, and thus this is the one calculation I'm least confident about, and it's likely going to have the biggest margin of error. But I doubt I'm more than like 50% off the mark or something on this one. Thus, when I plotted out the averages for loose raw crystal piles and boxes over the course of an entire run through the game, I ended up with 131,217. So, 45,240 plus 144,509 plus 131,217 gives us a grand total of 320,966. About 42% of the raw crystals we need to max out all of our stats. Thus, at first glance, it seems like legitimately maxing out all of our stats is impossible. But this is where the technicality comes in, because if there was a legitimate, infinite source of raw crystals, we'd be all set. And there actually kind of is, and it looks like this. Say hello to the spawning bug, a somewhat early game creature which first appears at 120 meters down, has a performing speed of 2, and gives you 33 raw crystals when you defeat it. Now, normally it attacks by biting you, but it has a special move which, when successful, will spawn a fresh copy of itself with full hit points, which is also worth 33 raw crystals, and is also capable of spawning another fresh copy. Yeah, you see where this is going. Legitimately maxing out your stats seems like it should be possible by taking advantage of the behavior of the spawning bugs. But there's a few problems with this approach. Firstly, since special moves always trigger after physical attacks, you're going to be getting your face bitten off the entire time. Now, if you maximize your bite defense specifically, then you're only going to be taking 1 hit of damage out of every 100 bites, which won't be too big a deal, but that's still a ton of raw crystals to dump into a single defense stat just to pull that off as soon as possible. The second problem is that you're going to be consuming oxygen and energy cells that entire time, so you need some way to refill these as the battle continues, and chances are you're not going to be able to keep those cells well stocked for the entire amount of fighting necessary, because in order to make up the difference of 426,539 raw crystals, we need to fight a grand total of 12,926 spawning bugs. And based on my own testing, with weapons powerful enough to one-shot these, you can expect to spend about 4 seconds on each individual spawning bug you fight, which to fight all the spawning bugs you would need to fight would take about 861 minutes, or essentially, you would be spending about 14.33 hours farming these things. So yes, if everything was working as expected, it would be technically possible to legitimately max out your stats, if you were willing to invest an insane amount of time into it. But there's one final problem, and it's the nail in the coffin which turns this possible yet ridiculous process into an impossible one. And it has to do with how the creature spawning mechanic even works internally. For starters, it's handled with a static array of all the creatures as opposed to a dynamic array. An array is just a collection of values, variables, objects, etc., whereby when the array is dynamic, its size can change as needed, but if the array is static, it will only ever be one size, never bigger or smaller. In the modern era of coding, dynamic arrays are a lot easier to handle, but in the days of DOS prior to proper memory management by the operating system, dynamic arrays were much more difficult to deal with. They weren't even supported by every programming language, and were often slower to access, thus it's rare to see them in use in DOS games. On top of this, the game is tracking how many creatures it spawned in total when generating the map, so that it knows which value in the array to adjust if a new creature is spawned mid-dungeon floor. But this tracking value can only ever increase, it never goes back down. Because of this, eventually this tracking value reaches the end of the array, and the game simply decides it can't ever spawn anything more on the map. I mentioned this to the game's author when this derailed my initial attempt at making this video, And I was told part of the reason for the creature spawning working like this was specifically to avoid infinite spawning and overwhelming the player. So yeah, no infinite spawns from the spawning bugs or many other creatures, thus no infinite source of raw crystals. Instead, since we can't max out our stats legitimately, let me give you all my biggest advice in terms of how you should be spending your raw crystals in the early game, since this game has the inverted difficulty curve and is hard to start, but easy to finish. The very first improvement you should purchase with your raw crystals should be 1% of damage improvement for 100 raw crystals. The reason is because this improvement is rounded up, meaning a 1% improvement guarantees that you do 1 extra hit point of damage with every single weapon in the game. An early game where creatures don't have many hit points at all, this makes a massive difference. Next, you want to get your oxygen expense down by 1 point at a cost of 250 raw crystals, then start saving up 1540 raw crystals exactly. Not for a performing speed boost, but to increase your visual range by 1 tile in all 4 cardinal directions. Well, this may seem unusual to go for before performing speed, except performing speed only helps with dealing with enemies, and the early game enemies are really not that threatening, whereas improving your viewing distance in all 4 directions raises your viewing space from 9 tiles to 25 tiles, which means you don't have to move around as much to explore the same amount of area, meaning you consume far less oxygen to do the same amount of exploration. After the viewing increase, save up another 1500 raw crystals to boost performing speed, then go for either 1.1 or 1.0 oxygen expense, then save up 2660 raw crystals to improve your viewing distance again, save up 4500 for the next performing speed boost. Then from there, things become a bit more flexible, but you don't want to wait too long on getting your performing speed maxed out, since you're going to start fighting speed 5 enemies as early as 210 meters. Also, don't worry about increasing your damage improvement any further until you start using weapons which deal 20 damage or more per attack on average. Then make an effort to start increasing your damage improvement percentage, since at that point, every 5% of damage improvement is an extra hit point of damage. Even more as you start getting stronger and stronger weapons. As for extract talent, it's really not all that necessary, especially since your biggest boost in cells is going to come from when you save a bunch of plant power mushrooms, as each one of those gives you a stacking temporary bonus to your extract talent, but each also plants a cell plant, so they're best consumed all at once in large batches, which in turn will temporarily max out your extract talent to 99% for more than enough time to profit off of each of those cell plants planted. Defense boosts are also not really that necessary, since so long as you're playing smart, you're rarely going to take hits from the enemies, and most of your health loss is going to come from the environment itself. Also, while having your oxygen expense below 1.0 is nice, it too is not really all that necessary. Now, after the initial floors and upgrades that I've mentioned, your 2 priorities following should be performing speed, followed by a mix of visual mapping and damage improvement. Anywho, I think that's about the most we're going to be able to figure out in terms of obtaining raw crystals and going for maximum stats in this game. You'll find links in the video description to download copies of the creature data that I compiled, as well as the stat improvement costs, for easy reference in terms of playing out your own runs through. And I also should point out that Ron Hughes, the creator of this game, still offers up the full version via email to anyone who asks, and doesn't have the requirement anymore of having to mention his stuff on your own website or social media account or whatnot. You can find a link to his website in the video description should you wish to peruse what he's been working on, and or contact him to get a copy of this game. So that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on October 21st will be a filler video, and because the past couple weeks have been a bit of a train wreck in real life, I'm just going to go back and showcase a pair of relatively modern games which I find really appealing, and which I consider to be 2 of the best tower defense games ever created. One of which even has an official crossover with the Portal games. Yeah, those Portal games. So be sure to stay tuned to see just how good a tower defense game can be. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.